I want to discuss the manner in which we connect science and theism, or science and religion, or science and God. We have to prepare some groundwork before we can discuss the details of theism, because there's many conceptions about how this can be done, many misconceptions. So the idea is to form some general ideas by means of which we can generate a proper understanding. And so, as Steve Sanchez said, I was at the University of Surrey, and now I'm at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory. And just as a disclaimer, this is not an officially authorized result or product of either of those institutions. By saying that theism has... So let's go back to what I call modern naturalism. Naturalism is the view that everything is natural, or nature, physical nature, what they mean, is everything that there is. And this is the implicit view of a lot of scientific investigation, as well as lots of other people who claim that they're following science. And this idea is that naturalism tries to allow only physical explanations for things. Everything comes as a cause which is physical. So it looks for mechanisms. So I have an example here of clockwork. That's a sort of symbol for mechanistic explanation. But of course, and then furthermore, the idea is not to rely on anything about God. So that they have explanations. They have tried to form an explanation about religion, for example, which explains the history of religions and the coming and going of sects and of all sorts of things, but without mentioning God. That's the sort of the naturalistic explanation of religion. But this modern naturalism actually has difficulties which tend to get brushed over. First of all, it doesn't explain about minds. It doesn't explain that we have minds. It doesn't say anything about minds. It doesn't say anything about consciousness. Consciousness is a rather of a mysterious process to modern naturalism. So there's a lot of debate in the literature among people saying that it can be reduced or it can't be reduced, or it's emergent, or various things. And then even more seriously, we don't have an explanation of the origin of life, the first life that's produced, nor do we have any explanation of why life has this detailed informational structure. The DNA is a coding for other amino acids and proteins. So that fact that there seems to be a design or an information built into the basis of life is still a mystery from the naturalistic point of view. Because Darwin, for example, thought that the living cell was just a bag of protoplasm and there wasn't any structure in it. And on that basis, you can imagine small changes to a bag or the collections of bags. But now we know that the DNA and cell structure is very much more complicated. But if you ask a scientist about these things that can't yet explain, they say, oh, but we're going to explain it in the future. We've made lots of progress, and just in a few years we're going to explain it. But they've been saying that for a long time. And so Karl Popper, as a philosopher, calls this promissory materialism. In other words, the materialists promise that in the future they will have an explanation. And the reply, of course, you've just solved the easy problems. What David Chalmers, another philosopher, calls the hard problems remain. But the question is, about promissory materialism, how long should we wait? Should we wait 50 years before deciding that materialism has failed, or 500 years? In other words, it's impossible to say yes or no if we always rely on the promise that sometimes science is going to explain these things. So what I want to say now is that we should try alternatives, and we should try them now. So I want to form an idea, develop ideas about theistic science, which connect science and religion without reducing them or separating them either, and we can see what predictions are made. And this should be carried on alongside existing science. So it's like let 1,000 flowers bloom. We should try different ideas at the same time. And this is what I've been developing over the last years, that I've been interested in both physics and Swedenborg and spiritual life and things. So you'll see in these talks the way I've developed in order to combine science and religion, and that I regard as an alternative to the naturalistic science. So you'll see the ideas that I present, and you can judge what they are. Now I say I want to form an alternative to science. So let's look and what science wants or needs to be scientific. The first thing is that it has to produce explanations, and scientists say they accept the best explanation. This is fairly basic perhaps, but that means that if I have an alternative view, or if we have an alternative view about minds and souls and nature and so on, we need to take that theory and make predictions from it which can explain the things we know. And if they provide a better explanation, then that becomes a scientific idea. But it's a bit more complicated than that, because scientists they say they just follow the best explanation, but they still have an overall view, sort of an ideological view about certain general properties of the world. If you want to have a little telescope like this, and you want to understand how it operates, you need theories about how to observe things. And when Galileo talked to the establishment in his time with his telescope, they knew that telescopes and lenses produced distortion. They weren't sure that looking through a strange glass object showed anything that was actually there, not just an artifact of the telescope. So in order to understand what telescopes are showing, you need to have a theory and practice and understanding about the details of telescopes. You need to know how to observe. And that means if you observe something which you don't understand, either that means your theory is wrong, or it means that you don't understand how to observe. And so lots of rebuttals to strange things that seem to be beyond science, they say, oh, but people are just imagining it. In other words, they're making a theory about observation. So there's an overall theory which influences everything that goes on. Related to that, you need an overall theory about how causes operate. If we're going to have an idea about causes which are not in regular science, then we need to have a fully fledged theory about what they are and how they operate. So we can talk about them unambiguously. We heard talk of correspondences earlier. That's an idea about how causes operate, but we need to understand the reason for correspondences. We need to understand the basis. And a more general point is that we say science tells us an explanation, but quite often when you look at how scientists think, they have had a theory on their own to start with, and they look for evidence to support it. That's what I'm doing. But it means that, in general, the conclusion about what exists shouldn't depend on the starting point. I mean, a lot of people, they make assumptions and they look for evidence to support it. And I can do that with theism and science. Other people do it with mechanistic or materialistic explanations. And so the only way to get around that difficulty is to have them both at the same time, and then other people compare the two explanations. In other words, it's a pluralistic view about how science should be allowed. So different overall theories should be allowed. So I'm trying to explain that I'm not trying to demolish existing science, but I'm trying to form an alternative structure next to the house of existing science. I'm trying to build another house, which we can build up and then see what it's like to live in. If it's nicer to live in and it gives a better explanation of scientific things, then we think it would be better. So those are the requirements we think we will need in order to be scientific. So let's think now about how we would go about forming a scientific theory that had theism and God in it. How would we do that? And because material science starts from the assumption that there isn't a God, so what can we do? Well, the obvious thing is to start from an assumption or a postulate that there is a God. If some people is allowed to start by assuming that there is no God, then we can form another building next door which is built on the assumption that there is a God, and we can follow that as an alternative. So it's in contrast to the naturalistic way. And then we have to spell out the basic ideas of theism. We have to spell it out without ambiguity, in a non-metaphorical way. We have to form ideas that can be understood as literally true. I mean, because when people look at, say, Genesis, they say, Genesis, the first chapter is true, but not literally true. Okay, but what is what is Genesis 1 referring to? That's the question. And if we were to understand what's going on, we should have an idea about what Genesis 1 is actually referring to. And the consequence of this is that no paradoxes are allowed, okay? Some philosophers are very keen on paradoxes, and here's an example of a visual paradox, a box which is paradoxical in 3 dimensions. You can't have that in 3 dimensions. So, by paradox, I mean 2 things which contradict each other, saying some philosophies of religion say that we are God, but we're distinct from God at the same time. Okay, so that's what I mean by a paradox. When 2 things are held that appear to contradict each other, or do contradict each other, but they're held at the same time. So that means we want to avoid all paradoxes, because it's well known from the logical point of view that if you have 2 things which contradict each other at the same time, then you can prove anything. That's the general feature of an inconsistent system is useless. So we want to keep rational consistency. And so therefore we emphasize a lot the rational consistency of the ideas that we're trying to present. And then furthermore, this is a general question of, actually it's a matter of taste, but this is the way that I've decided to proceed. Instead of saying that minds are nothing but brains, or that souls are nothing but minds, or that God is nothing but something, an idea in our mind, or God is nothing but the cosmos, or everything that there is, I want to avoid these, what I call reductionists, or nothing but explanations. We need to have a proper account of how there can be, for example, minds, and how they're related to brains, how they're connected, but they're not equal to each other. They're distinct, they're causally, one can affect the other can affect the one, and without demolishing to say we don't actually have minds. Because if we don't have minds, we don't think, we don't have ideas, we don't have feelings. So it's a serious problem to deny that there are minds. Then lastly, to make theistic science, we want to make predictions and compare with experiments. And we say that if the predictions are confirmed, then this is evidence in support of theistic science. That's the general principles of doing science, and we'll see as we do this whether you agree that the starting point is confirmed. Theism has empirical effects. It makes predictions about what happens in the world, and these happenings can be observed. I mean, because, well, the opposing view of that is what's called the non-overlapping magisteria view, or NOMA. Stephen Jay Gould, an evolutionary scientist, produced this name. And this idea is quite common. Another way of putting it is that science tells us how things happen, and faith or religion tells us why. This is a common way that many people use to divide science from religion. And it has some advantages. It protects science from religion. So if you want to have a religion or a theistic or idea about God that's doesn't feel threatened by science, one way of removing that threat is to say that these are not connected with each other. But this view, this non-overlapping magisterial view, has some serious defects, because if we're to know God, God must be able to influence us now. And if God is to be involved with the world, as most religions say that God is involved with the world, then it must make a difference. And you can argue that God can't make a difference. If the world has evolved completely as it has, but without God making a difference, then why do you need God if you can have an explanation without God? And so, but even just if we're to have an understanding or knowledge of God, or perception or anything like that, then there must be some influence. And furthermore, religion and theism do talk about what is and not just why things are. For instance, they talk about human nature, where we discuss whether we have souls or minds. These things are disputed by science, so that if theism makes predictions about this, we might be able to understand these things better. We might get a better understanding of psychology, or spiritual psychology, for example. And then in religious history, revelations have occurred. People said that God spoke to them and then they told us what they said. And we've had a dramatic example of that is incarnation. Someone appears to claim that they are God, or they and God are one. And so this is obviously a serious influence of God on the world, if that was true. Oops. And so what I'm saying is that there are overlaps between theism and the natural world. And if we are to understand what these overlaps are, we have to think seriously about exactly what religion is on one side and exactly what science is on the other. And we have to think of them in such a way that they can be combined and without collapsing into one, because there are some differences as well as connections. Now, if I present these ideas to a scientific group, there are some standard responses that they make. Some scientific objections to theism, and the first one is that if God were allowed as an explanation in science, then anything goes. They say no matter what happens, you can say, oh, God did it. The explanation of God did it could be used for any event whatsoever. Because God, they think of as some person with a free will outside reality who's not bound by any of the natural laws or anything, and so they think that's sort of so overwhelmingly different and would interfere with everything that they do. And if that were to happen, then you couldn't form any rules or patterns or regular or irregular activities. Comprehensible or incomprehensible things could equally well be explained by God. If God was making miracles happen all the time, then this wouldn't make sense. You couldn't do science like this. But we want to start by replying to this objection, is that God is not some arbitrary and capricious old man who can do what he likes. I mean, it's clear that as you get better at understanding of religion, there's a certain constancy and reliability about God, which not everyone agrees with, but as you get a better understanding, in my opinion, in fact, as the religions and the churches get a better understanding of God, there's it doesn't look like this. So that means that if we want to allow for scientific theism, we want to say that the previous reasons for opposing theism in science arise from misunderstandings about the nature of God. And we'll discuss, that's why we have to make it quite clear what the foundations for our theism is and explain it in a simple, rational way, without contradiction, without paradox, and to avoid these particular misunderstandings. And I believe that with the help of Swedenborg, we'll see later, there are some basic ideas which can be used in this way. And as I said, we know that there are considerable regularities in the world. And we should be able to explain the source and nature and reasons for these regularities. And as an example of this, we can say that the source of regularities might be the constancy and eternality of the love and wisdom of God. So that's a beginning of an explanation within theistic science about why there are regularities. But we then have to explain lots more about how these, with love and wisdom of God, operate and what the regularities that result and what they are. And so we have a little picture here. I think it's a Islamic picture. We'll talk about the sun. The sun, okay, the sun is a good metaphor or simile for God. Lots of religions have the shining star or the sun as a... God isn't a sun, S-U-N, but it's a source of light and heat, and that's similar, we believe, to love and wisdom. So, as an example of the questions to be answered, the first one is rather obvious. How can there be a personal God? Lots of people don't understand how there can be a personal God. How is that possible? And then there's the question of whether the world is made of one substance, monistically, or two, which is dualism, or whether there are many levels. Okay? you'll have heard discussion of planes of existence or the multiple dimensions of existence, but we'll discuss, those are metaphors for what I'm trying to talk about here, but not themselves very accurate descriptions. So but that's a sort of question we have to answer. And next week we'll have more discussions about levels. Okay, that's the same question there. And then, once we've answered those questions, we can then get on to what is the connection between the mind and the body. Once we have fully existing minds and brains, once we have multiple levels or planes, or whatever you call them, of minds and brains, we then have to discuss how they're related, because obviously when you think of something in your mind, you can move your hand. Obviously, your ideas can influence the physical world, and the question is how that's possible. And when you see things, physical worlds affects what you think. That's obviously happens, and so how. And then a rather more general question about the history of all of these things. How do these physical, biological, and mental structures come into existence? By that I mean, how do they come into existence historically? And we can discuss the history and the growth of an individual person. What happens when you're born and you grow up as a child? The children develop, they learn things in many different stages, and they get better at some things, and other things change and differ. And then there's the question of evolutionary coming into existence of life. How about evolution? What do these principles say about the production of new species, or the development of new kinds of processes, organs and bodies? And then there's also the question of how the world came into existence at the very beginning. We think of it as a Big Bang. Genesis has another story, and so there's other where you have to think about how God might have started off the world. So when we come to this question of proof, I want to discuss briefly about proof. And the question is, what does theistic science prove? Is it possible to prove that there is a God, for example? And in fact, from Aristotle and popularized by Augustine and even more by Thomas Aquinas, there are various proofs of God, about the first cause, about the first actuality, about the moral law, proofs about God. But they depend on understanding about nature. Aquinas used this Aristotelian understanding about nature. So I'm not going to use these proofs. They still exist, they're still valid, but they depend on some basic ideas about causes. And if you're changing basic ideas about causes, you have to look at what they are before going to these general proofs. So I'm not going to argue. Natural theology is the branch of theology that argues from nature and science to God. There's lots of people, they look at the recent results of science, and they say, this can only happen if there was a God. Okay, so I'm not going to do that. So other people can do that, but I'm not going to do it. I go to what I do, theistic science, which doesn't try and logically prove these 5 postulates. Rather, I'm going to start from those postulates. I'm going to start from those 5 principles of theism and see what predictions I make about what the world is like on the basis of those principles. And this is the opposite view to natural theology. That's what I would call sort of theistic science or theology of nature. And this is the way science normally operates, in fact. It starts, if you have a good science, you have a general principles of relativity theory or electromagnetism or quantum theory. These people start off, if they have a good understanding, they know what the principles are, they start from the principles and make predictions. And if the predictions are satisfied and confirmed, then it supports the starting point. And that's all I'm going to try. So at the end, you'll see what this theistic science looks like. After I've started from my 5 starting assumptions and made predictions about nature, about minds, about spiritual life, about evolution, psychology, and so on.